Welcome back to this, our third part in this series as we continue making our way through studying Bible prophecy. For those of you who joined me today for the first time, I totally encourage you to go back and see parts 1 and part 2, as these videos, these classes will build upon each other. So if you start today, you might get a little bit lost because we've discussed some things leading up to today's class. I have now put the roadmap back here behind me. We showed this on the first class, or since the first class, and we talked about on our first class, God is in control, as in nothing takes him by surprise. We also introduced the 4 principles of prophetic interpretation aimed to help us understand how to go about studying Bible prophecy, which are the 4 listed here on the screen. God is God and He's in control. We need nothing but the Bible to understand the Bible. Prophecies follow the course of history. And of course, when you open this beautiful book we call the Bible, you have to please go on your knees, ask God for guidance, and then start studying. Reading this book for the sake of reading it will yield very little. And in part 2 of this class, we completed this diagram here where we discussed in depth the prophecies outlined in Daniel 2 with Nebuchadnezzar's statue. We discussed what each of the metals represents leading up to the stone that crumbles the image. And of course, we draw a parallel between Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, where we discussed that each of the 4 beasts and the little horn and the Ancient of Days that appear at the end are basically the same, expanding more upon what we learned from Daniel 2. So Daniel 2 is a parallel of Daniel 7, or vice versa. And now, today, we're getting ready to jump into Daniel 8, where we're introduced to yet another vision. And as we'll get to see, this vision is actually yet another parallel. It expands upon what we see in Daniel 2 and what we see in Daniel 7, with the exception that now God has shifted gears and He's pointing the language, the symbology that He uses in Daniel 8 is actually pointing towards something else. What exactly? Well, stay tuned. I am so excited to do this study. I hope you're as excited, as pumped as I am. Let's do this. I want to start our study today looking at a very important verse that we found in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 4. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. So here, God is clearly instructing Daniel to seal the book until the time of the end. This to say, Daniel was to shut either the entirety of the book of Daniel or a part within the book of Daniel. But there's 2 things here from this verse that are clear. Number 1, this book was not to be shut or sealed forever. And number 2, knowledge with respect to that book was going to increase with time. When you look at the book of Daniel in its totality, the book is distilled into 3 main things. Number 1, it has actual characters and actual historical facts of things that actually happened during the times of Babylon, during the times of Medo Persia. Number 2, it has references to a prophetic landscape. So God provides within the book of Daniel the backbone, the skeleton of the prophetic time frame of what He wanted Daniel to know as to what's ahead. And number 3, this book talks about a judgment hour message that we're going to start studying today, and then we're going to finish talking at a later session. We have to remember that the name Daniel, the EL in Daniel's name, stands for God, and that names in the Bible have meaning. As we studied last time, Daniel means God is our judge. So in the book title itself, there are already connotations that there's a judgment hour message embedded into the book of Daniel. And that is clearly what we're going to start studying today from Daniel 8. So Daniel's 1 through 7 have historic references, has stories, and then it has Daniel 2 and 7, of course, which are the prophetic backbone. And as we'll see today, Daniel 8 to 12, it's almost its own book, okay? It's like a book within a book. And we have reasons to believe that Daniel 8 to 12, because it doesn't complete the picture as Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 does, from the times of Babylon all the way through God's coming. We have many reasons to believe that Daniel 8 to 12 is the little book that was to be shut. Now, let us evaluate the biblical evidence to support this statement. Let us understand why Daniel 8 to 12 is that book that was to be sealed. So the first reason why we believe that Daniel 8 to 12 is actually a book within a book and is the book that was sealed is because of language. It's actually a fairly simple reason. When you look at the original language in which the book of Daniel was written, we see that it was actually written in two languages. The introduction was in Hebrew, chapter 1, then from 2 to 7 it jumps to Aramaic, and then it switches back to Hebrew in 8 to 12. So the fact that there's two languages here being portrayed, basically the first half of Daniel is written in one language and the second half, 8 to 12, in another, it suggests in itself that there are separate things happening, that the book is split into two within the book. The second reason has to do with understanding. From the book of Daniel, we learn that Daniel's 2 and Daniel 7 and basically everything from 1 to 7 was very well understood at the times of Daniel and during the times of the Roman Empire. It was absolutely crystal clear for people what those symbols presented in Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 represented. It was well known that it talked about Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Hippolytus of Rome, commonly known as Saint Hippolytus, a man that lived during the Roman times, of course, had much to say about these prophecies found in Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. Even Porphyry, which was a pagan philosopher during the Roman times, had a lot of trouble thinking that the book of Daniel and those prophecies were written before the events happened because they were so extremely accurate that he actually thought that these events were written post facto, after the events had already occurred. So it is absolutely clear that the prophecies explained and shared in the book of Daniel chapter 2 and chapter 7, that first half was well understood. It is not the same, however, when we go into Daniel 8 and Daniel 12. Though Daniel 8 has elements that were understood because they tie back to Daniel 2 and 7, the judgment hour message was not understood at all until much later. As we've been reading in the past, we've been citing Ellen White, so Ellen White also has some comments to be made as to this little book and the understanding or not understanding of this book contained within Daniel. In the book Acts of the Apostles, we read the following. In Revelation, all the books of the Bible meet an end. Here is the complement of the book of Daniel. One is a prophecy, the other a revelation. The book that was sealed is not the revelation, but that portion of the prophecy of Daniel relating to the last days. The angel commanded, but thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book even to the time of the end. The judgment hour message is very closely tied specifically to the 2300-day prophecy found in Daniel 8. But she had more to say. In the book The Great Controversy, we find the following quote. The message of salvation has been preached in all ages, but this message is a part of the gospel which could be proclaimed only in the last days. For only then it will be true that the hour of judgment had come. The prophecies present a succession of events leading down to the opening of the judgment. This is especially true of the book of Daniel, but that part of his prophecy which related to the last days, Daniel was bidden to close up and seal to the time of the end. Not till we reach this time could a message concerning the judgment be proclaimed, based on the fulfillment of these prophecies. But at the time of the end, says the prophet, many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. So Ellen White actually makes it obvious why God will ask Daniel to seal the words, to seal the book until the time of the end. Because these books, Daniel 8 through 12, contains a judgment hour message with regards to the time of the end. And at the times of Daniel, that wasn't the time of the end. So that judgment hour message was not really applicable to that time, so it would not have made sense to understand it back then. There's yet another reason, and that is that the terminology, the beast, what we're seeing, changes drastically. There's really an atmosphere change in Daniel 8. In Daniel 2 and 7, and basically the first half of the book, everything feels earth-centered. It's talking about things that will happen here on earth. But on Daniel 8, it's a complete change in terminology. Though we still see kingdoms that are and events that are going to happen here on earth, everything points to spiritualness. Everything points to that judgment hour message. For starters, the beasts that are introduced in Daniel 8 are a male goat and a ram. And the use of these beasts, these particular animals, might actually tinkle in our brains and make us itch and make us remember that these animals actually appear in the Bible in the context of the sanctuary. Of course, the ram was the animal used in the daily sacrifice, and the male goat was the animal used during the Day of Atonement, which was one day in the year. So one is a daily sacrifice, one is a yearly sacrifice. And of course, as we continue to read through Daniel 8, we start seeing some terminology that is obvious that is not talking about earthly stuff. For example, we see phrases like daily sacrifices, sanctuary, the sanctuary shall be cleansed, the covenant, the end to sacrifice an offering, to finish the transgression. All these phrases are pointing to not earthly events, but spiritual events, heaven-centered events. The chapter as a whole basically is not centered on talking about kingdoms. Everything is pointing to the fulfillment of this 2300-day prophecy that is found in Daniel 8. Please note that chapter 8 introduces the 2300-day prophecy. Chapter 9 actually provides us with the starting point of this 2300-day prophecy. And chapter 10 to 12 completes the picture leading up to the 2300 days prophecy. A key word joining all of these chapters together from 8 to 12 is the word understand. Starting on chapter 8, Daniel is instructed to understand. On Daniel 9, an angel comes to help Daniel understand. And then 10 to 12, Daniel finally understands. So please, this is very important. Pay attention. This is one of the main reasons why Daniel 8 to 12 is a book within a book. Everything is judgment hour message center. Everything is centered as to the end of time. And everything is pointing to sanctuary services. We have the ram, we have the male goat, we have all these words talking about the sanctuary, the covenant, the finish of transgression, the daily sacrifices. All this to say there's clearly a change in tone and symbols from Daniel 1 through 7 to Daniel 8 through 12. Another reason is the full picture that is being presented to us throughout the book of Daniel. When you read on the first half, Daniel 2 and 7, Daniel 2 has all the statue, is explaining all the earthly kingdoms, and it finishes with the stone that crushes the statue, which we've talked that is when God returns, when Jesus returns. Then in Daniel 7, we're introduced to all of these beasts, all these four beasts, the little horn, and then it finished with the Ancient of Days sitting and the books are being opened. So there's a full picture, all the kingdoms that will happen and Jesus' return. That's Daniel 2. All the kingdoms that happens and Jesus' return. That's Daniel 7. But in Daniel 8, we are talked about kingdoms, but Jesus does not return in Daniel 8, nor in 9, nor in 10. Jesus shows up in chapter 12. Just as we have here on the screen, Daniel 12, 1 to 3 reads, "At that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. And at that time your people shall be delivered, every one who is found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." So clearly, Daniel 8 to 12 it's its own picture, because in Daniel 8 we start seeing, just as we had before, all these kingdoms, but the return of Jesus actually happens in Daniel 12. So from 8 to 12, all those chapters are a complete picture in its own, as opposed to Daniel 2 that has the complete picture, and Daniel 7 that also puts the full picture. I have yet another reason, and this is reason number 6. Revelation, the book of Revelations, completes a picture. It's a part of the puzzle. We will study this a little later at a future class when we talk about the 2300-day prophecy. But in the book of Revelations, a little book is introduced that is sweet in the mouth but bitter in the stomach. I have the verse here in the screen. Let's read. And this is found in the book of Revelations, chapter 10, verses 8 to 11. Then the voice which I heard from heaven spoke to me again and said, Go, take the little book which is open in the hand of the angel who stands on the sea and on the earth. So I went to the angel and said to him, Give me the little book. And he said to me, Take it and eat it. It will make your stomach bitter, but it will be sweet as honey in your mouth. Then I took the little book out of the angel's hand and ate it, and it was sweet as honey in my mouth, but when I had eaten it, my stomach became bitter. And he said to me, You must prophesy again about many peoples, nations, tongues, and kings. As we'll come to understand, when the judgment hour message was finally understood in the mid-1800s, the message that this prophecy contained was absolutely glorious. It was an amazing discovery or understanding of the Bible, of the God's prophetic calendar. So there was euphoria in the air, there was happiness in the air. But of course, this all led to a very bitter disappointment. Again, we'll study this more in depth when we talk about the Judgment Hour message and the 2300-day prophecy at a later class. I know that we have talked about a lot of reasons, so let's just sum them up just to be on the same page. There's 6 reasons. We have discussed 6 reasons why we believe that Daniel 8 to 12 is the book that was to be sealed, as God commanded in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 4. All the 6 reasons are the following. Number 1, there's a difference in language. The first half is written in Aramaic, the second half is written in Hebrew. Reason number 2, there's a change in understanding. At the times of Rome, at the times of Daniel, these prophecies outlined in Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 were well understood, to the point that people thought that it was actually a scam. But when it comes to Daniel 8 through 12, not everything in those prophecies was well understood, especially the part talking about the 2300 days, which contains a judgment hour message. Of course, it makes no sense for people to understand the judgment hour message back then because the time of the end had not yet come. Reason number 3, even Ellen White comments on this and picks up on the fact that Daniel 8 through 12 is the shut book. Another reason, and this was reason number 4, is a change in terminology. From Daniel's 1 through 7, everything is earthly centered. There are kingdoms, there are wars, there are earthly events, but in Daniel 8, we're being introduced sanctuary-related language. We see the ram, we see the male goat. One was the daily sacrifice, one was the yearly sacrifice, and then we start seeing all of these words talking about the covenant and the finish of transgression, the daily sacrifices, the sanctuary. So all of these words pointing to things happening in God's sanctuary. Reason number 5 was the completeness of the picture. Daniel's 2 explains all the historical kingdoms on earth, and then Jesus comes. Daniel 7, all of the kingdoms on earth, and then Jesus comes. But in Daniel 8, it talks about the kingdoms on earth, but the vision stops. God does not come. The part where Jesus comes to the earth doesn't happen in Daniel 8 nor 9. It actually happens in Daniel 12. So it's almost as if Daniel 8 to 12 is its own prophetic landscape from beginning to end, as opposed to before where it's all given in one chapter. And finally, in Revelation, everything is linked together when John is instructed to take this little book and eat it. It will be sweet in the mouth, bitter in the stomach. And as we'll study, this had to do with the judgment hour message when in the mid-1800s it was well understood. Everybody was excited because of what was going to happen. But then, of course, that understanding and the interpretation at the time led to a bitter disappointment. Worry not, we will study this in depth at a later class. So now I really hope it is crystal clear why we believe, or why is believed by scholars, that Daniel 8 to 12 is the little book, the part within Daniel, a book within a book that was sealed and shut, and that to be understood at the time of the end. Now that we understand this, let's just go ahead and dive into the Bible. Let's go ahead and start decoding and understanding Daniel 8 and what is being presented to us in this chapter. Disclosure: if you have not read Daniel 8, this is the part where I ask you to please stop this video, go read the chapter, and then come back. So before we actually start decoding Daniel 8, I did wanted to show all of the prophetic landscape that we've been studying with Daniel 8 in it. I am going to take myself off the screen so you can see it better, but I will keep talking to you from the beyond. All right, so here in the screen, you see Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 with all the symbols that are being presented to us. And then in the last column to the right, you see what each of these symbols represent. We studied this on the last class, but I have added now Daniel 8, and you can see that Daniel 8 the vision starts with the kings of Medo-Persia. And we'll dive deep in a minute here to start understanding what we're seeing in Daniel 8. But I just wanted to show you a full picture of what we've been studying so far and how these prophecies are parallel to each other and are expanding upon each other on specific things in the vision. All right, so our data point number 1, I actually wanted to start talking about how is this vision parallel to the previous vision in Daniel 7, because it's very apparent when we read the Bible. In Daniel 8:3, it actually says, "Then I lifted my eyes and saw there, standing beside the river, a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last." It is very interesting because if you think back, where else have we seen a beast that is higher on one side than the other, or that has an element that is higher than the other? The answer to this question is actually the bear shown in Daniel 7. In Daniel 7 says that there's a bear that is higher on one side than the other, and we talked about how this bear actually represents the Medes and the Persians. Now in Daniel 8, we're seeing a ram with 2 horns, and one of the horns was higher than the other. From the book of Daniel, we understand that horns represents kings or kingdoms. So this is basically saying that one kingdom, one king was more powerful than the other. And of course, we know this for a fact from history, because out of the Medes and Persians, though they were allies, the Persians were the strongest ones. Now, just in case there's any doubt that this is actually what this means, the Bible itself explains itself. So our data point number 2 is exactly that, and we find it in Daniel 8:20, where it says, "The ram which you saw having 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia." It is pretty obvious now that even though we did not need this verse to make the parallel between Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, now the Bible is being obvious into telling us that indeed this ram that has 1 horn higher than the other is the Medes and the Persians. So that's where we start our prophetic clock. In Daniel 8, we're being introduced to a second beast, which is the male goat, of course. And just as in Daniel 7, we talked about how from one beast to the next one means from one empire to the next one. Similarly, now in this particular vision, we're being told that the Medes and the Persians were to be succeeded by another kingdom. And that's our data point number 3, which we find in Daniel 8:21, where it says, "And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king." So I want to pause here and explain something that is very interesting. In Daniel 7, we see that Greece is represented by a leopard with 4 heads. However, in Daniel 8, we are being told that this particular kingdom had 1 king and then it split into 4. Okay, so in Daniel 7, we only see the 4 heads. In Daniel 8, we see the 1 king and then the 4 kings that come after that. A fact that we did not know from Daniel 7, now we're being told of it in Daniel 8. Once again, God continues to expand on his prophetic landscape to give us even more understanding. I want to zoom in here into Daniel 8:5, and I want to touch on this because again, we are expanding upon what we see on Daniel 7. And in Daniel 8:5, we read, "And I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes." Of course, we already know that this represents Greece, and the first horn represents the first king, which was Alexander the Great. But I want to zoom into the language that says that it came across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. In Daniel 7, we have a leopard with 4 wings. And you need only 2 wings to fly. If you have 4 wings, you're probably flying pretty fast. Now, in Daniel 8, it is evidently clear that this male goat was not even touching the ground, so he was exceedingly fast. Of course, this representing the swiftness, the quickness with Alexander conquered the European Empire at the time. All this to say, the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. All right, so now we understand that the ram is Medo-Persia, that the male goat is Greece, and that Greece had one notable horn, one king, that was the first king, Alexander the Great. We know that Greece was conquering extremely fast under the leadership of Alexander the Great. And now the Bible tells us that when this kingdom was at its peak, this notable horn, which Alexander the Great, was broken and four came into the picture. And that's where we start our data point number 4. As for the broken horn, and this is in Daniel 8:22, as for the broken horn and the four that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. So we know from history that Alexander the Great actually died fairly young. Again, suggesting that the prophecy, once again, of course, is right, in that at his peak, this notable horn broke, Alexander the Great, and now 4 comes in his place. Important to note that exactly as God had predicted, after Alexander the Great died and after many battles for power, the kingdom of Greece was divided into 4 main kingdoms. A common misconception among Bible prophecy students is that these 4 horns that came in lieu of the one that broke represents the 4 generals of Alexander the Great, which are Cassander, Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Ptolemy. So there's several problems. The first one being that horns in the Bible represent not necessarily just kings, but kingdoms. And also, when you study what happened after Alexander the Great died, there are many names that come into the picture, not just those 4. So we have to let Bible interpret the Bible, and you have to let history, as history continues to unfold, we'll see what was being explained in the Bible prophecies. So the Bible commentary actually says, and it's here on the screen, after Alexander died, Antigonus emerged as the last of the claimants for central power over the whole empire. He was opposed by a coalition of 4 powerful leaders, Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy, who were bent on dividing the territory against themselves. The long life and death struggle over the question as to whether the empire should be united under Antigonus and Demetrius or divided by the 4 generals was settled in the Battle of Ipsus in the year 301 BC. So you want to study about the division of Greece? Go ahead and study about the Battle of Ipsus. The Bible commentary continues saying, Antigonus was killed, Demetrius fled, and their territory was divided. This left, with the exception of the small fragments, 4 independent kingdoms. Ptolemy had Egypt, also Palestine are part of Syria. Cassander had Macedonia. Lysimachus had Thrace and a large part of Asia Minor. And Seleucus had the bulk of what had been the Persian Empire, northern Syria, Mesopotamia, and the East. And for those of you that are visual like me, I'm putting here on the screen the actual division of the Greek Empire once Alexander the Great died, and as decided by the Battle of Ipsus in the year 301 BC. You can see here on the screen that there's exactly 4 divisions of the kingdom, or 4 sub-kingdoms within still the Empire of Greece that existed after Alexander the Great. Once again, confirming that the Bible was right. Isn't the study of Bible prophecy such mind-blowingly beautiful? Okay, you might have already picked up in the fact that in this Daniel 8, we see one beast, we see a second beast, but there is no third beast as we would expect to see from what we've read in Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. We'll get to that in just a minute, but before we get to that, I did want to zoom in into this verse here that we find in Daniel 8:8-9, because that's our data point number 5 and something that we need to understand. There it says, Daniel 8:8-9, the large horn was broken, and in its place 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven, and out of one of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great towards the south, toward the east, and towards the glorious land. I want to pause and zoom in to the fact that it says that out of one of them came a little horn. That out of one of them, what does that mean? This has caused much confusion in the past. It has caused misinterpretations, and it has caused divisions even among prophetic scholars. This because we're seeing out of the one horn that we already know is Alexander the Great, when he was broken down, when he died, 4 came in its stead. He's talking about 4 horns. That's the part where he says, in place of it, 4 notable ones came towards the 4 winds of heaven. So he's talking about horns here, and he's also talking about the winds of heaven. So he says, toward the 4 winds of heaven, and out of one of them. So out of one of which? The horns or the winds of heaven. Interestingly, the Bible commentary says, and this is my personal, and now I'm saying personal because this is how I believe to be the correct approach, is this out of one of them is actually talking about the winds of heaven. It's not talking about the 4 horns, because the winds of heaven is the last noun used in the sentence. The Bible commentary reads, if them refers to winds, all difficulty vanishes. The passage simply states that from one of the 4 points in the compass will come another power. Rome came from the west. In the literal explanation of the symbols of the vision of Rome, it says to arise in the latter time of their kingdom. That is, the kingdom of the 4 horns. However, verse 23 refers only to the time when the little horn will arise and says nothing of the place of its rising, whereas verse 9 is concerned exclusively with its location. So this horn that is rising, 1 broke, 4 come, and now out of 4 come in the 4 compass directions towards the 4 winds of heaven, and now out of one of them, and that one of them is pointing to the winds. Out of one of the directions of the compass, another horn is rising, meaning, of course, another kingdom. That is my preferred explanation. But even if we don't use that explanation, the Bible is still in harmony if we are to understand that this new horn, which of course we know that it will be Rome, because Rome has to follow the sequence. Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 have already told us in 2 occasions that after Greece, Rome will come into power. So now in Daniel 8, we see the male goat with the 1 horn, Alexander the Great. We see that after he died, 4 horns come in its place. That's the 4 divisions of Greece after Alexander the Great died. And now the next thing that we would expect, it has to be Rome. So now this little horn is growing somewhere else. That somewhere else is in one of the compass directions, which we know to be the west. However, if one were to understand this to read that out of one of the 4 horns, out of one of those 4 divisions of Greece, Rome is coming, then we're basically suggesting that Rome is coming from within Greece. Interestingly enough, it is considering that politically and religiously the taking of Pergamum by the Romans, which was within Greece, that was of great influence to Greece and the development of the Roman Empire. So some have found solace in the fact that out of Pergamum that was within Greece, when Rome conquered that, was actually what helped develop the empire. And in the Encyclopedia Britannica, as we had used before, it says Attalus III Philometor Euergetes. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that name right, but you can read it on the screen. He was the king of Pergamum from 138 to 133 BC, by bequeathing his domains to Rome, ended the history of Pergamum as an independent political entity. So we have here in the historical records pointing to the fact that even if we were to interpret that this horn was growing from one of the 4 divisions of Greece, we still find harmony with what the Bible prophecy is telling us. So we can look at this 2 ways. Either this horn that we know has to represent Rome from Daniel 2 and 7, either it's growing from one of the compass directions, which we know to be west, or this horn, which is Rome, is growing from within Greece, and now we know, of course, that within Greece has to be when Romans took Pergamum, which was a part of Greece. Regardless of how we see this, the Bible continues to be accurate. All right, let's now talk about the actual little horn. We've already clarified from where it's rising. Now let's talk about it. And let's go back to Daniel 8 verses 8 to 9, where we read, "The large horn was broken, and in place of his 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of them," this is what we just discussed, came a little horn which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the glorious land. So the question has to be asked, why is there no new beast? If in Daniel 2 there's a new metal to represent Rome, in Daniel 7 there's a new beast to represent Rome, why are we not seeing a beast in Daniel 8 that represents Rome, and instead we're seeing here a horn? The answer is simply this. As we've been talking, the focus of Daniel 8 and on is not to repeat what is already being told in Daniel's 2 and 7. The focus here is to talk about the end times, the judgment hour message, and what's happening in the sanctuary. We've already said that there's a lot of sanctuary language here being used. So introducing a new beast when in the sanctuary all we used was the ram for the daily sacrifice, the male goat for the yearly sacrifice. Introducing a new beast will totally throw off the message that God is trying to give when it comes to the judgment hour message. In the sanctuary, only those beasts were used. Introducing a third one will totally throw the symbology off. And from what we studied, of course, horns represent kingdoms or kings. So now this horn is growing, and the fact that it's using that this horn is growing towards the glorious land, we already being hinted that this, of course, is talking about the little horn in Daniel 7 and about the feet mixed with clay and iron in Daniel 2. So clearly, this is speaking about Rome, but note that the verse says that this horn grew exceedingly towards the south and towards the east and towards the glorious land. So we're actually being presented with Rome in both phases, in one horn, in one sentence. Once again, God doesn't want to expand anymore on what he has already expanded as to what will happen in Rome or with Rome in Daniel 2 and 7. God just wants to blow right past this because the focus of this is not what has been told before, but to talk about the judgment hour message and the sanctuary symbology. And of course, this little horn that represents Rome, again, in both faces, and we are going to talk, our next study is going to be strictly on the little horn. But for now, let's just take solace in the fact that history confirms what the prophecy has told us, exactly as we would expect from Bible prophecy. Our data point number 7 is actually the cuspid of everything that we've talking about, because it makes it absolutely clear that the vision has a purpose, okay? And let's read it. It's in Daniel 8, verses 16 to 17, where we read, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. So the visions did not refer to explaining history, to explaining the kings, what was going to happen, to retouch based on what has already been explained in Daniel 2 and 7. No. This vision talks specifically and it zooms in as to the time of the end, which is when the judgment hour message will be applicable to. Data point number 8 is actually the key verse in this chapter. It's in Daniel 8:14, where it says, and he said to me, for 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. And the reason we've been speaking about judgment hour message is because of this verse. This verse introduces the concept the sanctuary will be cleansed, and we will get into more details later on in this class, in a future class, I should say. But the sanctuary was cleansed one day a year. If you look at the story in Exodus and Leviticus and the books of Moses, that was in the Day of Atonement. And in the Day of Atonement, virtually what was happening, what was taking place was a cleansing of sins of the sanctuary and a judgment hour day. So in order for us to understand this, of course, we need to go and understand what was the Day of Atonement, what it meant, what it entailed, and how it unfolded, because this is what Daniel 8 is pointing to. Once again, we'll talk about this later on. Finally, take note that this response comes because Daniel asks a question. How long will these terrible things that are being described in Daniel 8, how long are these things going to happen? And then the response comes after 2,300 days. And finally, our data point number 9 to help us close this in understanding of Daniel 8 it's Daniel 8:27, where it says, "And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Afterward, I arose and went about the king's business. I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it." Take note that nobody understood this particular thing, because this is going to become relevant when you read Daniel 9 and an angel comes back to explain. So Daniel didn't understand it and he fainted. He was sick. Why did he faint? Well, the answer is very clearly you have to put yourself in Daniel's context. So Daniel finds himself being captive. The people of God are being captive in Babylon. And Daniel is thinking, when are we going to get out of here? When is God going to restore us? All these horrible things, Daniel likely understood that this was happening during his time. And now God is telling that all of this will continue to happen for 2,300 days. In Bible prophecy, there's a day for a year principle. So one day is equivalent to 1 year. So he's looking and saying 2,300 years. Is that how much we're going to be here, captive, in prison, people of God? So of course, he doesn't feel well. He feels faint. He sickens. And he's definitely troubled. You can tell this from reading the context here. So that is everything that I wanted to share and talk about Daniel 8 today. I hope now it is absolutely clear. I have put back behind me here the chart that I showed at the beginning. It is clear that the ram with the two horns represent Medo-Persia, years 539 to 331. The male goat represents Greece, 331 to 168. Then the little horn that represents Rome, there's two faces to it. One, it extends towards the south and towards the east. That's imperial Rome. And then the little horn that grew vertical towards the glorious land, that is the little horn. And note that in what it represents, I put a different Rome sometime after 476 AD, because we have not yet talked definitive about who is this little horn and what is the time period that applies to it. We know how long it would last, 1,260 days, 60 years, but remember, day for a year, but we don't know what is this little horn, what exactly does this mean? And that's what we're going to be talking about next class. There's just one more thing I want to talk about, and that is about this gentleman, or he actually was a terrible man, so gentleman doesn't really apply. But this man called Antiochus Epiphanes, because if you study Bible prophecy, his name will come up. A lot of people actually have believed in the past and actually at present that the little horn that is presented in Daniel 7, it is different from the little horn that is presented in Daniel 8. Mainly because, as we explained, there is a beast, a unique beast to explain Rome in Daniel 7, and that beast that represents Rome, this little horn comes from it, versus in Daniel 8, that we don't have a third beast. We just have a new horn that is rising up that extends towards the south, east, and the glorious land. Of course, without understanding the true context or the things that we have talked about here, it is very easy to conclude that this little horn in Daniel 7 and in Daniel 8 are different horns, are referring to different kings or kingdoms. Because of this, many people have attributed the little horn that we find in Daniel 8 to be Antiochus Epiphanes, which was a terrible man. You can read about it online, that reigned during the times of the Greek Empire. And it will make sense if you don't understand the context, because again, this horn is growing amongst the four horns that are the four divisions of Greece, and this little horn comes. So it is seemingly easy at first to apply that Antiochus Epiphanes, which was from Greece, is this little horn that is presented in Daniel 8. But of course, once you understand the things that we study here, this is not the case. This little horn is exactly the same as the beast and the little horn in Daniel 7. It's just that it's all collapsed into one horn, because the symbology is pointing to the sanctuary, to the judgment hour message, to the 2,300-day prophecy. God doesn't want to re-explain or re-show what he already showed in Daniel 2 and 7. He just wants to point us to that judgment hour message. Hence, we already have the ram and the male goat, the daily and the yearly sacrifices. God doesn't want to mess the symbology of the sanctuary. Anyhow, just because this Antiochus Epiphanes made at first seem to make sense that this horn represents him, there's actually several reasons why it actually doesn't fit or apply. The first one, and they're all on the screen here, by the way, and I'm reading from fact number 2. The first one is that in the Bible, the horn that represents Medo-Persia, the language that it uses, it was a high horn, okay? And the Greece first king's horn was notable. It uses the word notable. And Alexander the Great was indeed a great and notable king. Now, when it's talk about this little horn in Daniel 8, it uses the word exceedingly great. And of course, it doesn't take much history study to understand that Antiochus Epiphanes' kingdom was very far from exceedingly great. It didn't even compare to the Medes-Persians or with Alexander the Great. He was just some random evil king that existed. His impact was fairly limited. So when the Bible uses the term or the language exceedingly great, you would expect something much more bigger than what Antiochus Epiphanes represents. So clearly, Antiochus Epiphanes doesn't fit the language structure that is being used in Daniel 8. The horn, the Bible says that this horn, again, Daniel 8, was to grow exceedingly great towards the south, toward the east, and towards the glorious lands. The Romans actually stopped his movement towards the south, and his movement toward the east faced complete stoppage when he died. So he wasn't just not exceedingly great, but he also didn't expand exceedingly great towards the south and the east, as the Bible explains it. So yet another thing that Antiochus Epiphanes doesn't really fit in this prophecy. Another language that is being used here in Daniel 8 is, and in the latter times of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise. This pointing to the fact that this little horn was to arise during the times of the four kingdoms. Antiochus Epiphanes actually rose about midway through divided Greece, so yet another thing in this prophecy that he doesn't check. And finally, of course, we have the 2300-day prophecy embedded in Daniel 8, that no matter how you look at it, and I'm not going to expand because we're going to study this prophecy later, no matter how you look at it, it doesn't really fit the description of what we know from history of Antiochus Epiphanes. The horn in Daniel 8 is not Antiochus Epiphanes. He does not fit the bill. This horn was to be exceedingly great, and Antiochus Epiphanes was very far from it. This horn is the exact same horn as the little horn in Daniel 7. Actually, that the whole beast in Daniel 7, including the little horn, because it's roaming both faces. There's not a third beast because the language in Daniel 8 wants to keep it pointed to the sanctuary, not to re-explain what was already told in Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. So if you go out there and somebody mentions Antiochus Epiphanes, I invite you, go ahead and study, open a historical book, read about him, and you will see very quickly that he just doesn't fit this prophetic landscape that we're being told. I really like that so far we have let the Bible interpret the Bible, and we have applied our principles of prophetic interpretation. God is not taken by surprise. He's glorious, he's majestic, and he has left for us in the Bible a clear picture as to what's ahead. Now, next week, we're actually going to be studying the little horn, this horn that grew exceedingly great. We're going to be studying Rome, and we're going to be studying specifically what is this little horn, this face of Rome, where there's a mix with clay. So please don't miss it, because from here on out, we're actually talking about things that are very relevant to us today. I can't wait to see you next time.